Welcome to Carbon Compass by Brundtland, where we explore meaningful conversations around driving South Africa towards a more sustainable future. This podcast is brought to you by Brundtland, where we use our in-house expertise to break down complex climate and sustainability topics in a way that is accessible and actionable. Brundtland is a purpose-built consultancy committed to empowering people to create a sustainable planet. We help key stakeholders navigate the complexities of a carbon-constrained world while balancing the needs of today with the ability of future generations to meet their needs in a responsible and equitable manner. Having successfully issued and commercialized over 7.5 million carbon credits across various sectors and technologies, Brundtland has established itself as a leading carbon revenue generation partner in Southern Africa. I'm Emma Reinecke, a sustainability consultant at Brundtland, and I'll be your host for today's episode. In this episode, we'll be discussing Verra's recently released VCS Standard 5 and what it means for project developers. This will be a roundtable conversation with a few members of the Brundtland team, each bringing their own unique backgrounds and perspectives to the table. I'm joined by Henk Sa, one of our partners and head of the carbon finance business. With over 20 years of experience within the carbon industry, Henk brings deep knowledge into how the carbon market is evolving, both in South Africa and globally. Hi, Henk.
Hi, Emma. Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Nimesha, a sustainability consultant at Brundtland with a civil engineering background, to provide us with a technical lens on project implementation. Great to have you, Nimesha.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
We're also joined by Dylan, also a sustainability consultant at Brundtland, who brings a finance and commercial perspective to the discussion. Welcome, Dylan.
Hi, Emma. I'm happy to be here and share some of my thoughts with everyone. Thank you.
And from my side, I'll be guiding the conversation with a more legal and governance-focused lens, particularly when we touch on legal ownership and stakeholder consultation. Henk, could you start by setting the scene for us? For listeners who may be less familiar, what is Verra? What is the VCS Standard 5? And why does this update matter for project developers?
Thanks, Emma. So the VCS stands for Verified Carbon Standards. And in essence, it's the rules against which potential emission reductions are assessed to see if they meet the threshold of being a carbon credit. The VCS forms part of the Verra, which is sort of an umbrella organization with a wide range of different quality standards. And I guess version 5 means that a new version of this constantly evolving VCS standard was recently published. This is important for project developers and basically everybody in the sector because it's a rule-based system. And in essence, this is a new version of these rules. And all projects, to some extent retrospectively, but mainly going forward, will be assessed against these new standards, against this new version of the standard.
Thank you, Henk. And to bring in the rest of the team, what do you think is driving this update? And what direction is Verra trying to move the standard in?
Hi, Emma. From a finance perspective, I think a big driver here is credibility. We've seen increasing scrutiny from buyers and investors around carbon credits, particularly around carbon quality and integrity. VCS version 5 feels like a response to that. It's about tightening the rules so that credits are more defensible and transparent and ultimately more investable. So I'd say the direction is very clearly towards higher integrity, even if it means more complexity upfront for developers.
To add to that, I think there's also been a shift from all of the standards to be more equal to each other and to allow for more standardization between all of the standards.
Thanks, Nimesha. From my own perspective, I'm aware, especially around 2 years ago, that there was quite a lot of skepticism around carbon markets and a bit of a push to bring more integrity into the process, especially around stakeholder engagement, and especially with the exposure of certain carbon credit projects not having followed strong stakeholder engagement processes. And I think a lot of version 5 is trying to address that. Dylan, before we get into the specific changes, can you explain when the VCS version 5 requirements come into effect and what project developers should be planning for now?
Yeah, so timing is actually quite important, and it's not completely uniform across all requirements. But the key point for developers is that most of the major changes apply to project registration requests submitted from 1st of January 2027 onwards. What that means in practice is that projects being developed now, especially those looking to register in 2026 or later, are going to be directly affected. So the takeaway is really that developers shouldn't wait. Even though we are not fully in a version 5 world yet, projects should already be designed with new requirements in mind. And then on the flip side, for projects that are already quite far along under the current version, there's a bit of a deadline. They need to get registered before the end of the year to avoid being pulled into the new framework. So there's almost this transition window now where timing and strategy really matters.
Thank you, Dylan. And Nimesha, the VCS has now implemented a distinction between project start date and crediting period start date that wasn't there before. And I'd just like you to explain how this affects pipeline listing and registration timelines.
Sure. So the VCS has clarified the confusion relating to these two terms. Essentially, the project start date is the very first date where an investment decision is made, whereas the crediting period start date is the first date where emission reductions occur.
Thanks. And why have they implemented the change, and what's the relevance of that?
Sure. So it's essentially both of these dates have deadlines associated with them. For the crediting period start date, this is related to pipeline listing. You must pipeline list your project within 1 year of the very first emission reduction. Whereas for the project start date, you need to have made sure that all stakeholder engagement has occurred before the first investment decision is made.
Yeah, I think the investment decision is important, right? Not only from a stakeholder engagement point of view, but also from an additionality point of view. If a project can demonstrate additionality, it needs to demonstrate that the carbon credits are not an afterthought. So that means that at the moment of decision making, you include the prospects of generating carbon credits for your project, which is different from the start date of when the first credit is actually generated.
Okay, perfect. So across the board, projects must pipeline list within a year of the first emission reduction. Have there been any other changes to overall registration timelines?
Yes, previously there was no deadline for pipeline listing. Essentially, pipeline listing is where you give the overview of the project to Verra, the idea that you're going to have this project and the intention of eventually registering it. Before the implementation of version 5, there was no set timeline for the pipeline listing. But with the new implementation, it has to occur within 1 year of the first emission reduction occurring. The registration timeline remains very similar for energy and industry projects. It has to occur within 2 years of that emission reduction date. There are various timelines that are tailored to the project type that the VCS has also now further clarified in the new version.
So you can go back 2 years for an
energy
industry project, and you can go back 5 years for a photo project.
But the caveat is that you still have to pipeline list within a year.
Yes, so that creates sort of a backstop on it not being an afterthought, which obviously if you have a 5-year time frame, that sort of could be a concern, right? So in this case, you would, even though you could go back 5 years when it comes to registration, you would still, 4 years ago, have to have pipeline listed the project, which would be within 12 months of the original start.
Precisely.
So, whereas for an energy project, that's different. For an energy project, you can go back 2 years in time, but again, you need to have 1 year before, 1 year after the start date, you need to have done the pipeline listing.
Essentially, there is less time for a project to initiate a registration because there is this 1 year limitation now. So the key takeaway would be that developers need to engage with stakeholders and carbon advisors earlier on to ensure that everything is met on time.
The crediting periods for projects have also been shortened. Could you elaborate on that?
Definitely. So in version 4, you had 7-year crediting periods that could be renewed twice. This gets you to a total of 21 years of crediting period. In version 5, you have a 5-year crediting period, which can also be renewed twice, which gets you to a total of 15 years. This change has been implemented to make sure that the crediting periods are renewed more frequently, that their baselines are checked more frequently, and to increase the integrity of the credits that are issued.
That's really interesting, Nimesha. Maybe you could talk a bit about whether this would affect project developers that have already registered projects with 7-year crediting periods.
So it does affect them, but not too much. Essentially, if they have already started a crediting period, that first 7-year period does not change. But when they re-register the project, they will have to do a 5-year period following that. So you do a 7-year period, and then you can do 2 5-year periods in addition to that. Then there's 4 years that are left over, which would take you to the 21 years, which you initially started with. And in order to fill that gap of 4 years, you are allowed to register for a 4-year bonus period. So projects that already have registered with the 21-year intention don't have any limitations to that entire period at the end of the day.
Okay, so in the end, they don't lose out.
No, they don't lose out. It just means that they have to register more frequently.
I think although you don't reassess additionality at renewal, having a shorter crediting period also strengthens the additionality of a project. Main reason being that if you go back to sort of first principles, the plain vanilla idea is that there is a new technology which does the same thing but with a smaller carbon footprint. The problem is it's more expensive. So the difference comes from the financial stream that results from the sale of carbon credits, which are based on the difference between the emissions using the old technology versus the new technology. If you make a shorter crediting period, the time frame over which such a project becomes, this new technology becomes standard technology and common practice is shorter, right? So you have less of an overrun whereby you are claiming carbon credits for something that initially was new and required this kind of indirectly financial support. Whereas you have a shorter crediting period, you don't have that overrun into a time frame where this is actually common practice, and you still claim carbon credits for it.
Thank you. So I think that makes it pretty clear that the shorter crediting periods would improve the integrity of the project and the credits it produces. Are there any other reasons for shortening the timelines?
Yes, there is a general trend for all standards to have a more frequent reassessment of the baseline. This is also in alignment with the Paris Agreement, which also has 5-year timelines, which aligns with the bigger picture for NDCs as well.
Another major change that's being introduced in the VCS version 5.0 is a shift away from ownership to the legal right to operate the project. So under the previous version, all project proponents had to demonstrate ownership of their projects, which was defined as the legal right to control and operate the project. They've now shifted away from the word ownership entirely and are just focusing on the legal right to operate and control. And simultaneously, they're also introducing this right to the reductions and removals. And I think in the past, there was maybe an underlying assumption that if somebody owned the project, if somebody had the right to operate, then they would also have the right to reductions and removals. But this has now become an explicit requirement. Also previously, VCS had introduced 7 different ways of evidencing ownership. And the problem with this is that they weren't exclusive of each other. So you could imagine in a project with multiple entities, that multiple entities could stand to prove project ownership. Now, under version 5, any analysis of the right to operate and right to reductions and removals must be a full legal analysis that concludes that there are no conflicting claims to the rights in the project.
This does remind me of a project I worked on long ago under the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, as a carbon standard, where a landfill gas to energy project, whereby obviously a municipality collects the waste, it goes into a landfill, and there's different stakeholders. The municipality has contracted a company that collects the waste. and they've rented a piece of land on which all the waste is being dumped. There's a company that on the landfill compacts the waste and manages the leachate runoff, etc., etc. And the question around who's responsible for all the environmental impacts of this project was always sort of a bit of a circular firing squad, whereby everybody pointed to everybody else, and therefore that question stayed in the middle because it represented obviously a liability, right? Who's responsible for this waste? A project then was implemented whereby they kept the landfill and extracted the methane as landfill gas and claimed carbon credits for that. So now there's, instead of a liability, there's a financial gain from these carbon credits. And all of a sudden, everybody's hand went up. The landowner said, well, obviously this project occurs on my land, hence I am the owner of the carbon credits. I don't understand how anybody else can also have a claim. The people that deposited the waste there said, well, without the waste, there's no carbon credit. So obviously I'm the one who causes this carbon credit project to happen. The municipality said, well, this is the waste of the people and we represent the people. So the carbon credits belong to the municipality. I think this ownership claim is complex, and it has to do with local legislation and not so much with the carbon standard. And I think it's also wise for the Verra to create a framework against which his ownership should be assessed, instead of trying to be the final arbiter on this question. Mainly because it comes and goes as the carbon price goes up and down. And with the assumption that the fight against climate change sort of heatens up, and therefore emitting of greenhouse gases becomes more and more expensive, the price of these carbon credits will go up, and therefore more peoples will put up their hands to claim that they are the owner of these credits.
Thank you, Henk. I completely agree. And I think that's a great example of the kind of legal disputes that can arise when ownership is not clear.
So, Emma, these changes are going to affect future projects. What about the projects that are already registered? Is it going to affect them?
Thank you, Dylan. That's a really great question. As I pointed out before, the right to reductions and removals was not an explicit requirement of the standard previously, and it was perhaps assumed that project owners already had this right. However, now, when existing projects go to renew their crediting periods from 2030 onwards, they will also need to explicitly demonstrate that right to reductions and removals, and the gap will finally be closed.
Thank you, Emma. Makes a lot of sense.
That's a good point. Thank you. Yep.
Verra has also made some changes to its additionality assessment at both the standard and methodology level. Dylan, maybe you could explain what additionality is and what the high-level changes are.
Sure. At a high level, additionality is really the backbone of any carbon project. It's the idea that the emission reductions wouldn't have happened without the carbon finance incentive. In VCS version 5, that principle hasn't changed. If anything, it is being reinforced. But there are a few important shifts that I would like to mention. One is the removal of the first-of-its-kind test, which historically allowed projects to argue additionality based on being early adopters. That has now been taken out, which puts more pressure on demonstrating additionality through more objective measures. Also, just linking to what Henk said earlier, when Nimesha was speaking, about the shorter crediting periods also strengthening additionality. This is because with shorter overall timeframes, there's less risk of projects continuing to generate credits once they've effectively become business as usual. From my perspective, what's really notable is the increased emphasis on robust financial additionality, so clearly demonstrating that the project wouldn't be financially viable without carbon revenue. While this is not entirely new to version 5, Verra has introduced enhanced tools to strengthen how the assessment is done.
So are these changes effective immediately, or do project developers have time to adjust to this?
Thank you, Nimesha. That's a very good question. It is worth noting that these new additionality tools won't all come in at once. They will be introduced alongside specific methodologies as the need arises.
So, does this have any implications for project developers?
Yes, it does, Henk. The implication for developers is pretty clear. You need strong evidence earlier in the process. financial modeling, investment analysis, and documentation can't be an afterthought anymore. They need to be built into the project design from day one. But the upside is that all of this should lead to high integrity credits, which ultimately supports pricing and market confidence.
Verra has also made large-scale changes to its stakeholder engagement and consultation processes. I won't go into too much detail on every single change since they are quite extensive, but some of the major changes include, for example, the introduction of a stakeholder classification system, and paired with that stakeholder classification system is the level of engagement that kind of stakeholder would require. And for example, local communities and Indigenous people are classified with the highest levels of engagement for carbon credit projects. Other changes include implementing a grievance redress mechanism from the project start date, and this goes back to the project start date that Nimesha was discussing. The standard has clarified that stakeholders need to be engaged before the project start date, and this was another important introduction with the introduction of the 2 start date mechanisms, because stakeholders should be engaged before major investment decisions are made, for example, before construction begins on a project. Another major change includes financial transparency, where benefit sharing mechanisms are entered into, and the standard has also clarified several aspects of free, prior, and informed consent, which is an international law principle, which is a right of Indigenous people and local communities.
Sorry, Emma, I just had a question. How do these stakeholder engagement changes affect projects which have already been registered on the Verra registry?
Thanks, that's a great question. So for existing projects, effective from their next crediting period or renewal request or verification request, which occurs after the 1st of January 2030, they will need to update their stakeholder engagement plans, implement stakeholder input trackers, and conform to other strengthened stakeholder engagement requirements to continue generating credits. And then in terms of future projects, developers do have some time because the project start date, where it occurs after the 1st of January 2027, is where they would need to fully implement all the new stakeholder engagement requirements. So if you're in the process of registering already, or if you've already committed to a project, you can continue to follow the current rules until January 2027.
So most projects that are being developed usually have an environmental impact assessment that they do for the project, which covers a lot of stakeholder topics. Is this type of assessment sufficient for the VCS rules?
Thank you, Nimesha. I think it's very easy for project developers to assume that because they've followed local laws or because they followed international guidelines relating to stakeholder engagement requirements, that they're in the clear and that they've met all the requirements they need to meet. And I think that in general and across the board, stakeholder engagement is required in a lot of environmental impact assessments, but perhaps is not fully aligned with the VCS rules and with the VCS requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, free, prior, and informed consent is quite an important one when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And in general, I would say, or for example, in South Africa, while you would undertake a stakeholder engagement process to get your environmental authorization, ultimately the decision maker would be a provincial MEC or the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So in other words, the stakeholders would not be giving that final consent. It would be an approval or a denial from another decision maker. So I wouldn't assume that just because you've followed a guideline or a law that you've fully complied with exactly what the VCS wants.
Perfect. Thanks for that clarification, Emma.
Emma, what would you recommend that a project developer does?
Henk, I would recommend that they engage with a carbon advisor very early on. In fact, they should be engaging with a carbon advisor probably before project start date, which Nimesha mentioned was a definitive investment decision, something like breaking ground and building something, because they need to ensure that they've properly categorized and engaged their stakeholders before unalterable decisions are made.
That sounds like good advice.
Could you explain Verra's move from the exclusions table to an eligibility table, and why that matters for project developers looking at project eligibility?
Yes, thanks, Emma. So in the previous versions of the standard, there would be a high-level exclusion table at the standard level. And they're moving away from that and to have a set of eligibility criteria at a methodology level, which is much more project specific. The main reason for this is that the table at the standard level was quite ambiguous, and they got lots of questions as to how to apply this table. For me personally, I think this is a wise move to move it to the methodology level, where it's much more project type and project specific to be able to assess if you meet these eligibility criteria or not. The problem with overarching eligibility criteria is that it assumes a similar or at least comparable setup across all 180 countries in the world, which is almost never true.
Is there a specific example of this already in implementation?
Yeah, the large-scale renewable methodology, where the standard level table had a quite broad exclusion. No grid renewable electricity was allowed as an eligible project under the standard. And then this is already where this kind of a table becomes problematic. The exclusion then would have things like, well, except if you would use a battery pack, or if the project would use 50% of the electricity generated or more generated to for its own consumption, then it would be eligible. Obviously, these are very project site specific, country electricity system specific criteria, and therefore much better to assess those at a methodology level instead of at a standard level.
Before we move on to the final takeaways, I'd like to open the floor to any other notable changes that we haven't covered yet. Are there any additional updates in VCS version 5 that stood out to you and that project developers should have on their radar?
I'll take that one first, Emma. There are updates to grouped project requirements, which are specific to capacity limits. In the past, capacity limits used to apply to each individual project within the larger grouped project. But now, these capacity limits apply to the entire grouped project, which is a lot more restrictive. I didn't go into too much detail, but that's essentially an important thing to remember.
Thank you, Nimesha. I think it's a very important thing also. From my side, one other change worth highlighting is the introduction of new project scopes, specifically for other engineered removals and ocean and marine resources. What this does is broaden the types of projects that can be developed under the VCS. So beyond the more traditional project categories, we are now seeing formal recognition of newer, emerging approaches to carbon removal. It's quite a strong signal from Verra that the carbon market is evolving, in particular towards solutions that focus on long-term removals and less conventional environments like oceans. For project developers, it essentially means more opportunity, but also the need to understand these newer categories and how they will be implemented in practice.
How exciting. We haven't elaborated on this too much today because our expertise lies more with energy and industry type projects. But Verra is also introducing a durability pilot whereby insurance policies and dedicated funds can replace the buffer pools that they use for forestry projects. In addition to that, Verra has also expanded the attributes of its VCUs or carbon credits. So previously, carbon credits issued by Verra were additional, durable, independently verified, traceable and not double counted, and robustly quantified. And now they've also added in that they are, by nature, participatory based, safeguarded from unmitigated harm, aligned with SDGs, and aligned with net zero.
Thanks, Emma. I think that's important because a carbon credit project sort of sits in the middle of society, right? It's not in a silo. So having other, labels that represent that is a good idea. I would have a concern around making sure that it's not a replacement mechanism. So what I sometimes see is the discussion going from, okay, well, this activity might not actually completely reduce the amount of emissions that you say it does, but it balances that out with new employment or other co-benefits. And I don't think that's the right way to go about it. Something needs to be a solid emission reduction activity on top of which it has co-benefits. Not it can be a slightly less emission reduction solid activity because it has other co-benefits. So as long as you strike that balance correctly, I think this is a great initiative.
Thank you, Henk. And to close, I'd like each of us to give one practical takeaway for project developers. So to the team, what is the one thing developers should be thinking about now in response to the VCS Standard 5?
I think it's important if you want to register a project to be proactive rather than be reactive. So if you think you've got a good idea for carbon credits, please get in touch with us.
From my side, if I had to leave developers with one takeaway, it would be start early on the financial case. Under version 5 of the VCS, your project's credibility is going to depend heavily on how well you can demonstrate additionality and financial viability. And that's not something you can retrofit later. So the stronger your financial story upfront, the smoother everything else becomes.
Thanks, Dylan. My takeaway is that stakeholder engagement is now a fundamental part of carbon credit projects. Developers should be engaging with stakeholders from day one, documenting that engagement and implementing clear legal agreements regarding rights and ownership from day one.
And I'm going to say the thing I always say, making credits is hard, selling them is easy. And version 5 hasn't changed that at all. It still is a rule-based system that requires you have all your ducks in order to make the carbon credits.
That brings us to the end of today's conversation. A big thank you to Henk, Dylan, and Nimesha for joining the podcast today and sharing your insights on the latest VCS standard updates. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to share it or leave a review to grow our community. You can also learn more about our work by visiting our website at www.brundtland.co.za or following our LinkedIn page. For business enquiries, please contact us via email at info@brundtland.co.za or telephonically on 011 4477 892, and we'd be happy to discuss potential ways for collaboration. Until next time!